The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of the small town. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, but the tranquility of the evening was about to be shattered. Officer Mark Harris, a man with a reputation for being tough and uncompromising, was on patrol. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fading light, but his eyes carried a hardness that spoke of years of cynicism and prejudice. He had always believed in maintaining order, but his methods were often questioned, and his biases were no secret. Tonight, however, he was about to cross a line that would change everything. In a dimly lit alley, a woman stood, her silhouette barely visible in the twilight. She was dressed in a flowing dress that swayed gently with the evening breeze. Her name was Alina, and she was pregnant, her hands resting protectively over her belly. She had been waiting for her husband, who was running late. Alina was not just any woman. She was the wife of the town's most powerful man, though few knew it. Her husband, Victor, was the boss, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But Alina preferred to keep a low profile, choosing to live a life away from the glare of her husband's influence. As she stood there, lost in thought, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the alley. Alina turned to see Officer Harris approaching, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. There was something about her that set him on edge. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy his authority. Without a word, he grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unyielding. Alina's heart raced as she tried to pull away, but Harris was stronger. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, his voice cold and accusatory. Alina tried to explain, but Harris wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. In a moment of rage and misplaced authority, he ripped her dress, the fabric tearing like paper in his hands. Alina gasped, her hands instinctively moving to cover herself. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to cry. She knew that this man had no idea who she was, and that made the situation even more dangerous. Harris, blinded by his own prejudice, didn't see the fear in her eyes, or the fire that was beginning to burn within her. As the scene unfolded, a car pulled up at the end of the alley. The door opened, and out stepped Victor, Alina's husband. His eyes immediately fell on the scene before him, and his expression darkened. He had always been a man of few words, but his presence alone was enough to command attention. Harris turned, his confidence wavering as he recognized the man standing before him. Victor's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down Harris's spine. "You know who you're dealing with?" he asked, his tone low and dangerous. Harris swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had heard stories about Victor, about the power he wielded and the lengths he would go to protect what was his. But in that moment, all he could think about was the mistake he had just made. Alina stood between them, her eyes locked on her husband. She knew that this was far from over, and that the consequences of Harris' actions would be severe. But she also knew that Victor would handle it in his own way. And that thought sent a shiver down her spine. As the tension in the alley reached its peak, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Harris' colleagues were on their way, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and the wheels of fate were already in motion. Victor stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Harris. "You have no idea what you've just started," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And with that, he turned, taking Alina by the hand and leading her away from the scene. The alley was left in silence, the only sound the distant wail of the sirens. Harris stood there, his mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. He knew that his life was about to change, and not for the better. But what he didn't know was just how far Victor would go to protect his family, and how deep the roots of his power truly ran. As the first of the patrol cars pulled up, Harris could only hope that he would survive the storm that was coming. But deep down, he knew that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the town to its core. The lines had been drawn, and the players were in place. But as the night deepened and the shadows grew longer, one question remained unanswered. What would happen when the boss's wrath was unleashed? The answer was something that no one, not even Victor himself, could fully predict. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, it was clear that the storm was just beginning. The rain began to fall harder, each drop hitting the pavement like a drumbeat, echoing the tension that now hung heavy in the air. Victor guided Alina to their car, his hand firm but gentle on her arm. She was trembling, not just from the cold but from the shock of what had just happened. Victor's face was unreadable, a mask of calm that hid the storm raging inside him. He opened the car door for her, his eyes scanning the alley one last time before he got in beside her. The engine roared to life, and they drove off into the night, leaving Harris standing in the rain, his uniform soaked, and his mind a chaotic mess. As they drove, Alina finally broke the silence. "Victor, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Victor glanced at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of anger. "This is not your fault." Alina nodded, but the guilt still weighed heavily on her. She had always tried to stay out of Victor's world, to live a life that was separate from the power and danger that came with being his wife. But now she realized that was impossible. The lines between their two worlds had blurred, and there was no going back. Meanwhile, back in the alley, Harris was trying to gather his thoughts. His colleagues had arrived, their faces a mix of confusion and concern as they took in the scene. "What happened here, Mark?" one of them asked, his voice cautious. Harris shook his head, unable to find the words. He knew that whatever he said now would only make things worse. He had crossed a line, and there was no easy way out. As the other officers began to investigate, Harris felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He had always believed that his badge protected him, that it gave him the authority to do whatever he deemed necessary. But now, for the first time, he felt vulnerable. Victor and Alina arrived home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. The house was a fortress, surrounded by high walls and guarded by men who were loyal to Victor above all else. As they stepped inside, Alina felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was her sanctuary, the one place where she felt safe. But even here, she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking just outside the door. Victor led her to the living room, where a fire was crackling in the hearth. He sat her down on the couch and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Alina, I need you to tell me everything," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to know what happened." Alina took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the evening. She told him about how she had been waiting in the alley, about how Harris had approached her and the way he had treated her. As she spoke, Victor's expression darkened, his jaw tightening with each word. When she finished, he stood up and walked over to the window, staring out into the rain. "This won't stand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No one touches my family and gets away with it." Back at the police station, Harris was trying to piece together what had just happened. He had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but he knew that was just the beginning. The other officers were avoiding him, their usual camaraderie replaced by a tense silence. Harris felt isolated, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff with no way to turn back. He knew that Victor was a powerful man, but he had no idea just how far that power extended. As he sat in the empty briefing room, his mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. Victor, meanwhile, was already putting his plan into motion. He had contacts everywhere, in the police force, in the government, in the criminal underworld. He knew how to get things done, and he wasn't afraid to use every resource at his disposal. He made a series of phone calls, each one more urgent than the last. By the time he was done, a network of people was already working to gather information, to find out everything they could about Harris and his past. Victor wasn't just looking for revenge, he was looking for justice, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. As the night wore on, the tension continued to build. Alina tried to sleep, but her mind was too restless. She kept replaying the events of the evening in her head, each time feeling a fresh wave of fear and anger. She knew that Victor would protect her, but she also knew that his methods could be ruthless. She had always tried to steer him away from violence, to remind him of the man he used to be, but now she wasn't sure if that was enough. The world they lived in was harsh and unforgiving, and sometimes it felt like there was no room for mercy. Harris, too, was unable to sleep. He spent the night pacing his small apartment, his mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. He knew that Victor was coming for him, and he had no idea what that meant. He thought about running, about leaving town and starting over somewhere new. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. Victor would find him, no matter where he went. Harris felt trapped, like a rat in a maze with no way out. He had always been a man of action, but now he felt paralyzed, unable to see a way forward. As dawn broke, the town began to stir, unaware of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. Victor was already up, his mind focused and his resolve unshakable. He had spent the night gathering information, and now he was ready to make his move. He knew that Harris was just a pawn in a much larger game, but he also knew that sometimes you had to take out the pawn to get to the king. As he stepped out into the morning light, Victor felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about protecting his family. This was about sending a message, and he was ready to deliver it. Alina watched him from the window, her heart heavy with worry. She knew that once Victor set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. She wanted to believe that he would do the right thing, but she also knew that the line between right and wrong was often blurred in their world. As she watched him drive away, she whispered a silent prayer, hoping that he would find a way to navigate the storm without losing himself in the process. The town was quiet, but the calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface, tensions were rising, and the stakes were higher than ever. Victor's plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Harris, meanwhile, was still trying to figure out his next move, but time was running out. The conflict was coming to a head, and when it finally erupted, it would change everything. The question was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? And at what cost? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain. The storm was coming, and no one would be spared. Victor's car sped through the quiet streets, the morning sun casting long shadows across the road. His mind was sharp, focused, and his hands gripped the steering wheel with purpose. He had spent the night piecing together every detail about Harris, his past, his connections, and his weaknesses. Victor wasn't just a man of power. He was a man of strategy. He knew that to dismantle someone, you have to strike where it hurt the most. But as he drove, a part of him wrestled with the weight of his actions. Alina's face, filled with worry, lingered in his mind. She had always been his moral compass, the one who reminded him of the man he used to be. Yet this time he couldn't afford to hesitate. The stakes were too high. Meanwhile, Harris sat in his dimly lit apartment, the walls closing in on him. He had spent the night replaying the events in the alley, the look on Alina's face, and the cold, unflinching gaze of Victor. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, but now he felt like a cornered animal. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from the station, from colleagues, from unknown numbers. He ignored them all. He knew what was coming. The town was small, and secrets didn't stay buried for long. His past mistakes, the ones he thought he'd left behind, were resurfacing, and Victor, he realized, was the kind of man who would date until he found every last skeleton. By mid-morning, the town was buzzing with whispers. News of the incident in the alley had spread, though the details were murky. Some said Harris had assaulted a woman. Others claimed it was a misunderstanding. But one thing was clear. Victor's name was being mentioned in hushed tones. People knew better than to cross him, and the fact that Harris had somehow drawn his ire sent ripples of fear through the community. The police station was in chaos, with higher-ups scrambling to contain the situation. Harris' colleagues, once loyal, now kept their distance, fearing they might be caught in the crossfire. Victor arrived at an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place he rarely visited, but today, it served as the stage for his final move. Inside, a small group of trusted men waited, their faces grim. They had been busy through the night, gathering evidence, making calls, and ensuring that every piece of the puzzle was in place. Victor walked in, his presence commanding silence. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. One of the men nodded, handing him a folder filled with documents and photos. Victor flipped through them, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said. "Let's end this." Back in his apartment, Harris finally answered a call. It was from his lawyer, a man he had worked with for years. The news wasn't good. "Mark, you need to get out of there," the lawyer said, his voice urgent. "They're coming for you. Victor's got everything, your records, your past, everything. He's not just going to ruin you, he's going to bury you." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He had always thought of himself as invincible, but now he realized how wrong he had been. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, but as he stepped outside, he was met with a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Victor's car was parked across the street, and Victor himself stood leaning against it, his arms crossed. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. Harris froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew there was no running now. Victor stepped forward, his movements deliberate. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Harris nodded, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Victor's presence. They drove in silence to the warehouse, the tension between them palpable. When they arrived, Victor led Harris inside, where the group of men waited. Harris' eyes darted around the room, taking in the scene. He felt like a man walking into his own execution. Victor handed him the folder. "Take a look," he said. Harris opened it, his hands trembling as he flipped through the contents. It was all there, every mistake, every misdeed, every secret he had tried to bury. His face paled as he realized the extent of what Victor had uncovered. "What do you want from me?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to understand the consequences of your actions," he said. "You thought you were untouchable, but you were wrong. You hurt my family, and for that, there will be justice." Harris swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew there was no way out of this, no deal to be made. Victor wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, and Harris had foolishly stood in his path. But then, something unexpected happened. Victor stepped back, his expression softening just a fraction. "I could destroy you," he said. "I could make sure you never see the light of day again. But that's not what I'm going to do." Harris looked up, confusion etched on his face. "What are you saying?" he asked. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "I'm giving you a choice," he said. "You can walk away from this town, leave everything behind, and never come back. Or you can stay and face the consequences of your actions. The choice is yours." Harris stared at him, stunned. He had expected violence, retribution, but not this. Victor's offer was a lifeline, but it came with a price. One that would cost him everything he had ever known. He nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I'll leave," he said. Victor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said. "But remember this, if you ever come back, if you ever even think about crossing me again, there will be no second chances." As Harris walked out of the warehouse, the weight of his choices heavy on his shoulders, Victor watched him go. He felt no satisfaction, no joy in what he had done. This wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting what mattered most. He thought of Alina, of the life they had built together, and he knew that he had done what he had to do. But he also knew that the cost of power was high, and it was a price he would always have to pay. Back at home, Alina was waiting for him. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes filled with questions. Victor sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's over," he said simply. Alina nodded, her relief palpable. She didn't need to know the details. She trusted him. But as she leaned into him, she couldn't shake the feeling that their lives would never be the same. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. The town moved on, as towns often do. Harris was gone, his name quickly fading into obscurity. Victor and Alina continued their lives. The events of that night lingered in the background, a reminder of the fragile balance between power and morality. Victor had proven that he would do whatever it took to protect his family, but at what cost? The question hung in the air, unanswered. In the end, the story wasn't just about a clash of power or a moment of injustice. It was about the choices we make and the consequences we face. It was about the lengths we go to for the people we love, and the price we pay for our actions. And as the sun set on the small town, casting its golden light over the quiet streets, it left behind a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. In a world where power and prejudice collide, the true measure of a person lies not in their strength, but in their humanity.